The most dangerous moment in a marriage is when one person becomes completely certain the other will never leave. Rain rolled slowly down the massive glass windows of the Holloway penthouse, while Manhattan shimmered beneath the storm in blurred gold reflections. Inside, everything looked expensive enough to belong in a magazine. White marble floors. A grand piano near the fireplace no one ever touched. Crystal glasses glowing beneath warm pendant lights while soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers overhead. Ryan Holloway stood near the bar wearing a dark tailored suit with the easy confidence of a man who had spent years being admired. Investors laughed around him while a private chef carried trays of untouched food through the dining area. At 39, Ryan had become the kind of billionaire people listened to before he even finished speaking. Charming, sharp, effortlessly important. Across the room, Madeline Brooks adjusted the sleeve of her cream silk dress while quietly collecting empty glasses left behind by guests too distracted to notice her. 10 years ago, she used to photograph strangers in Paris streets and crowded New York subways, chasing emotion through the lens of an old Leica camera. Now she spent most nights hosting parties for men, discussing hedge funds beside million-dollar views. One of Ryan's friends laughed loudly near the bar. "So tell me honestly," he asked, swirling whiskey inside a crystal glass. "How does a man like you stay married this long in New York?" Ryan smirked faintly. "Simple." More laughter circled the room. "My wife would forgive anything." The men chuckled in agreement. Someone muttered, "That confident, huh?" Ryan leaned casually against the marble counter without even glancing around for Madeline. "No matter what I do, she stays." A few feet away, hidden partially behind the hallway glass leading toward the bedrooms, Madeline stopped walking. The tray in her hands became suddenly heavier. She did not interrupt, did not make a scene. The city lights reflected softly across her face while laughter echoed through the penthouse like distant noise underwater. Ryan kept talking. "Madeline hates conflict. Besides, she likes the life." One investor raised an eyebrow playfully. "Careful. One day she might surprise you." Ryan laughed under his breath. "No chance." The words settled coldly into the room around her. Not because they were cruel, because they were careless. As though her love had become something predictable, permanent, guaranteed. Madeline stared at Ryan from behind the glass partition while he smiled effortlessly beside the skyline he spent years conquering. There was a time when she used to admire the ambition in his eyes. Back when they shared cheap coffee in Brooklyn apartments and spent late nights dreaming about futures neither of them could afford yet. Ryan used to ask about every photograph she took back then. He used to carry her camera bag when her shoulders hurt after walking through Manhattan all day. Somewhere between private jets and billion-dollar portfolios, he stopped asking what she saw through her lens entirely. A woman beside Ryan suddenly glanced toward the hallway. "Where is Madeline tonight anyway?" Ryan shrugged casually, probably making sure everything looks perfect. More soft laughter. Madeline lowered her eyes toward the silver tray trembling slightly in her hands. She realized something painful then. Ryan no longer saw her as a person with dreams or loneliness or limits. She had quietly become part of the luxury surrounding him. Reliable as the penthouse lighting. Elegant as the marble floors. Permanent as the skyline outside. She slowly placed the tray onto a nearby table before turning silently down the hallway. No one noticed her leave the room. Upstairs, the bedroom felt strangely cold despite the warmth below. Madeline stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park while rain streaked down the glass in silver lines. Behind her, designer dresses filled the closet beside jewelry she barely wore anymore. Gifts. Apologies disguised as luxury. She looked toward the dusty black Leica camera resting untouched on the top shelf near old storage boxes. For a long moment, she simply stared at it while laughter drifted faintly upward through the penthouse floors. Then Madeline crossed the room slowly and lifted the camera carefully into her hands for the first time in years. The leather felt worn and familiar against her fingertips, almost like touching a forgotten version of herself. Some marriages do not collapse in one dramatic moment. They disappear quietly beneath years of being emotionally overlooked. The party ended sometime after midnight. One by one, Ryan's investors disappeared into private elevators while rain continued sliding down the penthouse windows in silver lines. Staff cleared crystal glasses from marble counters. Jazz music faded into silence. Through it all, Ryan barely noticed Madeline upstairs. He remained near the fireplace, discussing Tokyo markets with a client, while his phone vibrated endlessly with late-night messages and financial alerts. By the time he finally entered the bedroom, the city outside had become a blur of wet lights beneath the storm. Madeline stood near the closet wearing one of his oversized cashmere sweaters, her blonde hair falling loosely across one shoulder while she held the old Leica camera carefully in her hands. Ryan loosened his tie without really looking at her. Everyone loved the party, he muttered distractedly while scrolling through emails. Warren said we should host again before summer. Madeline nodded faintly. That is nice. Ryan tossed his phone onto the nightstand and finally glanced toward her. You okay? The question sounded automatic. Habit more than concern. Madeline looked down at the camera resting against her fingertips. Do you remember when I used to photograph people? Ryan frowned slightly, as though searching through old memories he had not touched in years. Of course. She tilted her head gently. What kind of photography did I like most? Ryan paused. Silence stretched awkwardly between them. Somewhere below, thunder rolled softly above Manhattan. Finally, he gave a tired shrug. Street photography, right? Madeline smiled faintly, but sadness lingered beneath it. Mostly portraits. Ryan missed the expression completely. He already reached for his phone again. You should start doing that stuff again if you miss it. Stuff. The word landed strangely in the room. As though the dream she once built her entire identity around had become a hobby too small for his attention now. Madeline turned slowly toward the window overlooking Central Park while Ryan answered another business message beside her. She remembered nights years earlier when he used to follow her through crowded subway stations just to carry spare camera lenses in his coat pockets. Back when he admired the way she saw emotion in strangers no one else noticed. Before success taught him to measure value only through numbers. Ryan, she asked quietly, still staring out at the rain. When was the last time you looked at one of my photographs? He barely lifted his eyes from the screen. I do not know. A while ago, probably. Madeline nodded once. Yeah. Ryan finally sensed something distant in her voice and lowered the phone slightly. Why are you asking me all this tonight? She turned toward him calmly. I think I wanted to know whether you noticed me disappearing. The room fell silent after that. Ryan stared at her with mild confusion, like someone hearing a language he no longer fully understood. Madeline, you are overthinking things. She almost laughed at how quickly men used those words whenever women described loneliness too honestly. Ryan sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. Look, I know I have been busy lately. Lately. The words sounded almost funny after years of emotional absence disguised as ambition. But everything I do is for us. Madeline glanced around the enormous bedroom. Designer furniture. Soft ambient lighting. Luxury layered over emptiness. Sometimes I think you built a beautiful life, she whispered softly, and forgot to leave room for me inside it. Ryan opened his mouth slightly, searching for a response that never fully arrived. His phone buzzed again against the nightstand. Instinctively, he reached for it. Madeline watched him answer another message before he even realized what he had just done. Something inside her became very still then. Not angry, not dramatic, just tired in a way that no amount of luxury could fix anymore. Later that night, after Ryan finally fell asleep beside glowing city lights, Madeline remained awake alone near the window with the Leica camera resting in her lap. Rain tapped gently against the glass while traffic moved far below like rivers of red and white light through Manhattan streets. She lifted the camera slowly and looked through the lens toward her own reflection in the dark window. For a long moment, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The frightening thing about emotional distance is that one person usually notices it years before the other finally feels the silence. Morning sunlight spilled softly across the Holloway penthouse the next day, turning the marble floors pale gold while Manhattan slowly woke beyond the towering windows. Ryan adjusted the cuff of his navy suit near the kitchen island while financial news played quietly from hidden speakers overhead. His phone rested beside an untouched espresso, vibrating every few seconds with market updates from London. Across the room, Madeline stood silently near the counter wearing a loose white sweater and faded jeans, the Leica camera resting beside her hand like something recently rediscovered. Ryan barely looked up. I may need to fly to Zurich next week, he muttered while scanning emails. The Jensen deal is getting complicated. Madeline nodded faintly. Okay. Ryan continued talking without noticing how automatic her response sounded. There is also the foundation dinner Thursday night. Claire and David will be there, so we should probably stay at least an hour. We should stay. Madeline stared quietly out the windows while steam curled upward from her coffee mug. Somewhere below, yellow taxis moved through wet Manhattan streets like tiny flashes of gold between buildings. Ryan finally grabbed his espresso and glanced toward her. You are quiet today. Madeline almost smiled at the irony. She had been quiet for years. He was only noticing because the silence had finally become impossible to ignore completely. I did not sleep much, she replied softly. Ryan nodded distractedly. You should take a spa day or something. Something. Again. Every emotional wound reduced to another luxury solution. Madeline lowered her eyes toward the Leica camera resting on the counter. Do you remember when we met? Ryan loosened his tie slightly, caught off guard by the question. Of course. Where? He frowned while thinking. Brooklyn. Madeline waited. Ryan smiled faintly. At that rooftop party your friend dragged you to. She looked at him carefully. No, Ryan blinked. No. We met at a photography exhibit in Soho. Silence settled awkwardly between them. Ryan laughed softly under his breath like the mistake was harmless. Right? Yeah, that is what I meant. But Madeline remembered every detail perfectly. The black coat he wore that night. The cheap wine in plastic cups. The way he stood staring at one of her photographs for nearly 10 minutes before asking who captured it. Back then, Ryan used to look at her work like it mattered. Like she mattered. Now he could not even remember where their story began. His phone buzzed again. Instinctively, Ryan reached for it before the silence between them became too uncomfortable. Madeline watched him answer another message while sunlight reflected against the windows behind him. Suddenly, she realized something heartbreaking. Ryan loved her in the way people love familiar things. Comfortably. Assumingly. Without attention anymore. Around noon, Ryan kissed her lightly on the forehead before leaving for work. Do not forget dinner Thursday, he called while stepping toward the elevator. It matters. The elevator doors closed softly behind him. Madeline stood motionless inside the enormous apartment long after the silence returned. Then slowly, she walked toward the bedroom closet. Rows of expensive dresses lined the walls beside designer handbags and untouched jewelry boxes. Beautiful things chosen for a woman Ryan believed she still was. Madeline reached toward the highest shelf and pulled down a dusty storage box hidden behind old winter coats. Inside rested stacks of printed photographs tied carefully with faded ribbon. Paris street musicians beneath rain. Elderly couples dancing outside cafes. Lonely subway riders staring through scratched train windows. Human moments full of emotion and imperfection. Madeline sat quietly on the floor flipping through the photographs one by one, while afternoon light stretched slowly across the carpet around her. Then she found an old picture of herself reflected in a store window years earlier, camera hanging around her neck, smiling with a kind of freedom she had not felt in a very long time. She stared at the photograph until tears almost formed before quietly setting it aside. Not because she missed the past, because she suddenly realized how long she had been grieving herself without fully understanding it. Outside the penthouse windows, Manhattan glittered beneath bright spring sunlight. But inside the apartment, something had already started ending quietly. Freedom did not arrive for Madeline like a dramatic explosion. It arrived quietly on a gray Tuesday morning, while sunlight slipped through the windows of a small Brooklyn apartment that smelled faintly of coffee and old wood floors. The apartment was barely 1/10 the size of the Holloway penthouse. No marble hallways. No skyline dining room. No silent staff moving through expensive rooms pretending not to hear lonely conversations. Just one narrow kitchen, a worn leather couch near the radiator, and windows overlooking a noisy street where people hurried beneath umbrellas carrying grocery bags and paper coffee cups. Madeline stood barefoot beside the sink wearing an oversized sweater while rain tapped gently against the glass. In her hands rested a chipped ceramic mug she bought herself from a tiny bookstore cafe 2 blocks away. Somehow it meant more to her than half the luxury gifts inside the penthouse ever had. Her phone buzzed softly against the counter. Ryan. She stared at the screen while the vibration continued across the wood surface. For a moment, she considered letting it ring forever. Instead, she answered quietly. Madeline. Ryan's voice sounded tight, controlled, the kind of calm wealthy men used when life stopped obeying them. Where are you? Madeline looked out toward the rain-darkened Brooklyn street below. I left. Silence. Then a sharp exhale on the other end. I can see that. His voice hardened slightly. What is this supposed to be? Madeline closed her eyes briefly. Even now he thought this was about punishment. Drama. A reaction. It is not supposed to be anything, she replied softly. I just needed to breathe again. Ryan fell silent. Somewhere behind his voice, she could hear the distant echo of the penthouse. Probably standing beside those giant windows looking over Manhattan, confused why the silence suddenly felt heavier than usual. You disappeared without saying anything. Madeline glanced around the apartment. A small stack of books near the couch. Her Leica camera resting beside the window. Half-unpacked boxes filled with old photographs and sweaters she forgot she loved wearing. I spent years trying to say things, Ryan. Another pause. This is because of one stupid joke? The sadness in Madeline's chest deepened slightly at how little he understood. No, she whispered. It was because you stopped seeing me long before that. Rain continued sliding slowly down the apartment windows while traffic hissed across wet pavement outside. Ryan lowered his voice. Come home. Home. Madeline looked around the tiny apartment again. It was imperfect, loud, modest, but for the first time in years, she did not feel emotionally trapped inside it. I do not think that place has felt like home for a long time, she admitted honestly. Ryan sounded frustrated now, though he tried hiding it beneath composure. Madeline, people do not just walk away from 10 years because they feel neglected for a while. She almost smiled sadly. A while. Men like Ryan always measured emotional pain in moments because they never carried it daily inside their bodies. You are right, she said quietly. People leave because they feel lonely for years. Silence settled heavily between them again. Then Ryan sighed. You are overreacting. The words landed softly this time, but they still carried the same quiet dismissal she had been swallowing throughout their marriage. Madeline stared toward her reflection in the rain-covered glass. That is the problem, she whispered. You still think this is temporary. Before Ryan could answer, she ended the call gently and placed the phone face down on the counter. The apartment became quiet again except for rain and distant sirens somewhere across Brooklyn. Madeline inhaled slowly, waiting for panic or regret to arrive. Instead, she felt lighter. Not happy yet. Healing was quieter than happiness. Later that afternoon, she wandered through the neighborhood carrying her Leica camera beneath a gray coat while cold spring rain misted softly across the sidewalks. A little girl laughed while spinning beneath a red umbrella outside a bakery. An elderly man sat alone beside a laundromat window reading a newspaper while steam fogged the glass around him. Madeline lifted the camera instinctively. Click. The sound echoed softly beneath the rain. For the first time in years, something inside her answered back. Healing rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Sometimes it looks like a woman quietly learning how to exist again without asking permission to take up space. 3 months passed slowly in Brooklyn. Spring softened into early summer while Madeline rebuilt her life one ordinary morning at a time. She developed small routines that would have seemed insignificant to the woman she used to be inside the Holloway penthouse. Buying fresh flowers from the old woman near the subway station every Friday. Drinking coffee beside the apartment window while sunlight climbed across the wooden floors. Walking through Manhattan for hours with her Leica camera hanging around her neck, capturing strangers who looked emotionally honest in ways wealthy people rarely did anymore. A man asleep against a bookstore window after a double shift. A teenage couple laughing beneath neon lights in Chinatown. A lonely businesswoman eating dinner alone beside rain-covered glass. Madeline photographed all of them quietly. Somewhere along the way, she realized she had spent years surrounded by luxury, but starving for authenticity. Her apartment slowly transformed too. Printed photographs covered the walls now beside stacks of photography books and half-finished cups of coffee. Jazz played softly from an old speaker near the kitchen, while afternoon lights stretched across scattered negatives and editing notes. The space was messy, alive, nothing like the carefully controlled perfection Ryan preferred. Sometimes he still called. Less often now. Their conversations became polite and strangely distant, like people remembering a relationship instead of living inside one. One evening Ryan asked quietly, Are you coming back? Madeline looked out her apartment window toward the glowing Brooklyn Bridge while traffic moved beneath the summer rain. I do not think I belong there anymore, she answered honestly. Ryan remained silent for several seconds before muttering, You are throwing away a good life. Madeline almost smiled sadly, because that sentence explained everything about them. Ryan still measured happiness through appearances. The penthouse, the money, the luxury. He never understood that loneliness could exist beautifully packaged inside all of it. One humid Thursday evening, Madeline wandered through Midtown carrying her camera beneath soft golden sunset light. Street musicians played jazz near a subway entrance while crowds rushed around them in expensive suits and wrinkled uniforms alike. Then she noticed an elderly man standing completely alone beside a florist shop, holding a bouquet of white roses while watching couples pass him on the sidewalk. Something about the sadness in his posture stopped her immediately. Madeline lifted the Leica instinctively. Click. The shutter echoed softly through the evening noise. The man turned slightly afterward and smiled at her with tired eyes. Did you get a good one? He asked gently. Madeline lowered the camera. I think so. He nodded toward the flowers in his hands. My wife loved white roses. The way he said loved carried enough silence behind it for Madeline to understand. I still buy them every Thursday, he admitted softly. Feels wrong not to. Madeline stared at him for a long moment while traffic lights reflected against the wet sidewalk around them. That is beautiful, she whispered. The man smiled faintly before disappearing slowly into the Manhattan crowd. Later that night, Madeline sat cross-legged on her apartment floor editing photographs while warm rain tapped against the windows. The image of the old man holding white roses glowed softly across her laptop screen. Loneliness, devotion, grief, love surviving even after absence. Her phone buzzed beside her editing notes. Unknown number. Madeline answered carefully. Hello. A woman's elegant voice responded immediately. Is this Madeline Brooks, the photographer? Madeline hesitated slightly. Yes. My name is Eleanor Price. I curate exhibitions for Mercer Gallery in Manhattan. Madeline froze. Mercer Gallery was one of the most respected independent art spaces in New York. Eleanor continued warmly. Someone sent me your street photography collection. I have not stopped thinking about it for 2 days. Madeline lowered her eyes toward the photographs scattered around her apartment floor. Her heartbeat quickened slightly beneath the sound of rain outside. Your work feels emotionally rare, Eleanor said softly. It captures loneliness without making people look broken. Silence settled gently between them before Eleanor asked the question that quietly changed everything. Would you consider showing your work publicly? Madeline looked around the small apartment, glowing beneath warm yellow lamplight. The camera beside her, the photographs covering the walls, the life she rebuilt from silence. Then for the first time in years, she answered something without fear. Yes, she whispered. I think I would. The strange thing about rediscovering yourself is that the people who ignored your light often become the first ones blinded by it later. Summer settled heavily over Manhattan by the time Eleanor Price finalized Madeline's first gallery exhibition. The city glowed beneath humid evenings and blurred taxi lights while tourists crowded sidewalks carrying iced coffee and shopping bags through streets that smelled faintly of rain and concrete after sunset. Inside her Brooklyn apartment, Madeline sat cross-legged on the wooden floor surrounded by framed photographs waiting to be delivered to Mercer Gallery the following morning. Soft jazz drifted through the room, while a warm table lamp cast golden light across scattered negatives and handwritten notes. She paused beside one photograph in particular, the elderly man holding white roses beneath the florist's shop. Loneliness wrapped carefully inside devotion. Eleanor called it the emotional center of the collection. Madeline stared at the image quietly before placing it into a protective sleeve. 3 months earlier, she could barely recognize herself in a mirror. Now strangers were describing her work as unforgettable. Her phone buzzed softly beside her knee. Ryan. She hesitated before answering. Hey. His voice sounded different lately, less controlled. Tired around the edges in a way expensive suits and polished confidence could not fully hide anymore. I heard about the gallery. Madeline leaned back against the couch slowly. News travels fast. Ryan gave a faint, humorless laugh. In my world? Always. Silence settled between them for a moment while traffic echoed distantly outside her apartment windows. Then Ryan spoke again, quieter this time. "Why did you never show me these photographs?" Madeline looked around the apartment, filled with images covering nearly every wall. "I tried." Ryan said nothing, because somewhere deep down, he remembered all the nights she once asked him to look through unfinished collections while he answered emails beside her without really paying attention. He remembered promising they would travel again once work slowed down, promising he would make time, promising a future that never actually arrived. "Madeline," he said carefully, "I did not realize you were this unhappy." She closed her eyes briefly after hearing that word. Realize. The tragedy of their marriage had never been cruelty. It was emotional absence, so gradual Ryan barely noticed it happening while she slowly disappeared beside him. "I know," she whispered softly. That was the problem. Across Manhattan, Ryan stood alone inside his penthouse office, staring out at the skyline through towering glass windows. The apartment behind him remained perfectly designed and painfully empty. No photographs resting on the counters anymore. No half-finished coffee cups near the windows. No jazz softly playing from another room late at night. The silence inside the penthouse had become impossible to escape now. "I miss you," Ryan admitted quietly. Madeline lowered her eyes toward the framed photographs beside her. For a second, sadness flickered through her chest. Not because she wanted to return, because once upon a time, hearing those words from him would have meant everything. "I spent years missing you while standing right beside you," she said gently. Ryan inhaled sharply but did not argue. Somewhere behind him, the city lights reflected across the dark windows like another world moving without either of them. The next morning, Mercer Gallery buzzed quietly with final preparations before the private exhibition opening. Workers adjusted lighting while Eleanor moved carefully through the room, inspecting placement details beneath soft golden spotlights. Madeline entered carrying the last framed photograph against her chest. The gallery smelled faintly of fresh paint, polished wood floors, and expensive wine waiting behind the bar for evening guests. Eleanor turned immediately and smiled warmly. "There she is." Madeline glanced around the room slowly. Her photographs lined the walls beneath elegant lighting. Subway loneliness. Rain-soaked city streets. Human connection hidden inside ordinary moments most people rushed past too quickly to notice. For the first time in years, she saw pieces of herself displayed openly instead of hidden away for someone else's convenience. Eleanor stepped beside her quietly. "There is something unusual about your work," she said softly. "It feels like every photograph was taken by someone who understands loneliness personally." Madeline looked toward the image of the white roses near the far wall. Maybe they were. That evening, while rain drifted softly across Manhattan outside glowing gallery windows, a business magazine landed on the polished desk inside Ryan Holloway's office. He barely glanced at it while reviewing investment reports until a familiar photograph on the cover stopped him completely cold. Madeline stood beneath soft gallery lights, holding her Leica camera with calm confidence in her eyes. Above her image, bold black letters stretched across the page. The anonymous photographer capturing New York's loneliness. The cruelest kind of regret arrives quietly, usually at the exact moment someone else finally begins appreciating what you ignored for years. Rain drifted softly across Manhattan the night of Madeline's gallery opening, turning the city streets below Mercer Gallery into rivers of reflected gold and white light. Black cars lined the curb while elegant guests disappeared beneath umbrellas toward the glowing entrance, where warm jazz floated into the humid summer air. Inside, the gallery buzzed with quiet admiration. Wealthy collectors stood beside oversized black and white photographs, discussing emotional composition in hushed voices, while servers moved gracefully through the crowd, carrying champagne on silver trays. Madeline stood near the far wall wearing a simple black satin dress with her blonde hair pinned loosely above one shoulder. No diamonds. No dramatic makeup. Nothing about her looked desperate for attention, and somehow that made her impossible to ignore. People gathered around her naturally throughout the evening, asking questions, praising her work, wanting to know the stories behind each photograph. Madeline answered calmly, occasionally smiling in that quiet way people do after surviving something painful they no longer need to explain. Near the center of the gallery hung the photograph of the elderly man holding white roses in the rain. Beside it stood a small silver plaque with the title, Thursdays After Goodbye. Guests lingered in front of it longer than any other piece. It feels heartbreaking, one woman whispered softly to her husband. No, he replied quietly while staring at the image. It feels lonely. Across the room, Eleanor Price noticed Ryan Holloway entering through the gallery doors beneath soft amber lighting. His charcoal suit looked perfectly tailored as always, but something about him seemed different tonight. Less untouchable. The confidence he carried for years now looked strained beneath exhaustion he could no longer fully hide. Conversations shifted subtly through the gallery once people recognized him. Ryan barely noticed. His eyes moved slowly across the photographs covering the walls instead. Subway riders staring silently through scratched windows. Couples sitting inches apart while looking emotionally worlds away. Lonely figures surrounded by beautiful city lights that somehow only made the isolation feel heavier. Then Ryan stopped completely in front of one photograph near the back of the gallery. A woman standing alone inside a luxury penthouse while Manhattan glowed behind floor-to-ceiling windows. Her reflection in the glass looked almost ghost-like against the city lights. The title beneath it read, "Beautiful places can still feel empty." Ryan stared at the image so long the surrounding noise gradually disappeared around him. Because suddenly he understood what Madeline had been trying to tell him throughout their marriage without ever finding words painful enough to explain it fully. The loneliness inside their home had always been visible. He simply chose not to look directly at it. That one usually makes people uncomfortable. Ryan turned sharply at the sound of Madeline's voice beside him. Up close, she looked calmer than he remembered. Healthier somehow. Like someone no longer carrying invisible emotional weight across her shoulders every day. Ryan glanced back toward the photograph. Did you take this while we were still together? Madeline nodded once. About a year before I left. Silence settled softly between them while jazz music drifted through the gallery in the background. Ryan lowered his eyes briefly. Was it really that bad? Madeline studied him carefully before answering. You know what the hardest part was? He said nothing. Feeling lonely beside someone who thought expensive things could replace emotional presence. Ryan swallowed slowly. Around them, guests continued admiring photographs without realizing the real story. Behind many of them stood quietly between the artist and the man beside her. Madeline, he began softly. I never wanted you to feel invisible. She gave a faint sad smile. I know. Ryan looked at her then with genuine confusion. Then why does it feel like you stopped loving me overnight? Madeline glanced toward the rainy windows near the front of the gallery. Because you only noticed the silence once I was gone. The truth in her voice landed heavier than anger ever could. Before Ryan could answer, Eleanor approached with an older art collector beside her. Madeline, Eleanor said warmly. Richard Bennett would like to discuss purchasing the full collection. Ryan turned slightly as the silver-haired collector smiled at Madeline with visible admiration. Your work belongs in Paris, he told her sincerely. People are going to remember your name. Ryan stood motionless beside them while gallery lights reflected softly across the photographs surrounding the room. And for the first time in years, he realized strangers were seeing the extraordinary woman he once believed would quietly stay beside him forever, no matter how little attention he gave her. Some people only begin listening after the silence becomes loud enough to echo through every room they once took for granted. The gallery slowly emptied near midnight while rain continued falling outside Mercer Gallery in soft silver streaks beneath the city lights. Staff members collected champagne glasses from marble counters while jazz drifted quietly through the nearly empty space. Most of the photographs had already sold. Small red dots rested beside frame after frame across the walls, marking pieces purchased by collectors from Manhattan, Paris, and Chicago. Madeline stood near the front windows watching reflections of headlights slide across the wet streets outside. She held a paper cup of now-cold coffee between both hands while exhaustion settled gently across her shoulders. Not unhappy exhaustion. Fulfilled exhaustion. The kind that arrives after surviving something emotionally difficult and finally creating something beautiful from it. Behind her, Eleanor Price approached with a warm smile and a folder pressed lightly against her chest. You should probably sit down before I tell you this. Madeline turned slowly. That sounds dangerous. Eleanor laughed softly. Richard Bennett bought the entire remaining collection. Madeline blinked once. All of it. Every photograph. Eleanor opened the folder and handed her the paperwork carefully. And he wants exclusive rights for a Paris exhibition next spring. For a second, Madeline simply stared at the numbers on the page without fully processing them. Her photographs. The quiet moments she captured while rebuilding herself alone in Brooklyn. The loneliness she once believed nobody noticed. Suddenly those images mattered to the world beyond her tiny apartment walls. Eleanor touched her arm gently. You did this, Madeline. Across the gallery, Ryan stood motionless near the photograph titled Beautiful Places Can Still Feel Empty. He had remained there nearly 20 minutes after everyone else drifted toward conversations and wine. The image unsettled him more the longer he looked at it, because he recognized the loneliness in that woman standing before the Manhattan skyline. He had seen that expression before in real life. Late nights inside the penthouse. Charity dinners. Quiet mornings over untouched coffee. He simply convinced himself it was temporary sadness instead of emotional starvation. Eleanor eventually noticed him and quietly moved away, giving them privacy without saying a word. Ryan crossed the gallery slowly toward Madeline. His hands rested in his pockets like he no longer fully knew what to do with himself emotionally. Congratulations, he said softly. Madeline looked up from the paperwork. Thank you. Ryan glanced around the nearly empty gallery where her photographs still glowed beneath soft amber lighting. Everyone here sees something extraordinary in you. Madeline lowered her eyes briefly. That feels strange to hear after spending so long feeling invisible. Ryan swallowed hard after that sentence. The honesty in her voice no longer sounded angry. Just true. And truth was much harder to defend against. Rain tapped softly against the gallery windows behind them while workers quietly dimmed lights near the entrance. Ryan looked at her carefully for a long moment before speaking again. Do you know what scares me the most? Madeline said nothing. I think you stopped needing me long before I realized I needed you. The vulnerability in his voice surprised even him. Madeline stared toward the rain-covered streets outside. Ryan, she said gently, I never wanted to stop needing you. He lowered his eyes. Then why does this feel so final? Madeline thought about that for several seconds before answering quietly. Because I spent years asking someone to notice me while slowly disappearing beside him. Ryan closed his eyes briefly. Somewhere deep inside him, regret had finally transformed into something heavier than guilt. Understanding. The kind that arrives too late to undo damage already done. Then Eleanor returned holding a sleek black invitation card. Madeline, she said warmly, Richard Bennett insists you attend the collector dinner tomorrow night. She smiled faintly. Apparently Paris is very interested in meeting you. Ryan looked at the invitation in Madeline's hands while the reality settled slowly into his chest. The woman he once believed would quietly remain beside him forever was becoming someone the world wanted more of. Someone moving forward without him. Madeline thanked Eleanor softly before gathering her coat from the nearby chair. Ryan watched her slip one arm through the sleeve while city lights shimmered across the rain outside. Then suddenly he remembered something painful. Years ago, before billion-dollar deals and private jets consumed his life, Madeline once told him her biggest dream was simple. I just want people to feel something when they see my work. Standing there inside the glowing gallery surrounded by photographs strangers could not stop staring at, Ryan realized her dream had finally come true. The tragedy was that she achieved it only after walking away from the man who should have believed in her first. Sometimes the saddest endings are not loud at all. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in beautiful rooms, while one person realizes too late that love had been disappearing beside them for years. Rain still covered Manhattan the night Madeline finally left Mercer Gallery for the last time after her exhibition closed. The city glowed beneath silver reflections and blurred headlights, while warm summer wind carried the distant sound of traffic through the wet streets. Inside the nearly empty gallery, workers dimmed lights one section at a time until only a soft amber glow remained across the polished floors. Madeline stood near the entrance, slipping her coat over the black satin dress she wore all evening. Her Leica camera rested carefully inside the leather bag hanging from her shoulder. The same camera Ryan once encouraged her to buy when they were young and dreaming together in tiny Brooklyn apartments. Funny how life sometimes circles back to the exact pieces of ourselves we almost abandoned. Ryan remained near the center of the gallery long after everyone else disappeared. His hands rested loosely inside his pockets while he stared at the final photograph, still hanging beneath a single spotlight. A woman standing alone behind penthouse glass while Manhattan glittered outside like another unreachable world. Beautiful places can still feel empty. He understood the photograph completely now. An understanding arrived with a kind of pain money could not soften. Madeline approached quietly. "They are closing." Ryan turned toward her slowly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rain tapped gently against the windows behind them, while the city lights reflected softly across the gallery floor between them. Ryan studied her face carefully, like someone trying to memorize details he once overlooked too easily. "You look happy," he admitted finally. Madeline thought about the question honestly before answering. "I think I look peaceful." Ryan lowered his eyes after hearing that. Peaceful. Such a simple word. Yet somehow he realized he had not given her that feeling in years. "Madeline," he said softly. "If I had noticed sooner." She gave him a small, sad smile before he could finish. "But you did not." The truth settled quietly between them. No anger. No cruelty. Just reality arriving too late. Ryan nodded once, accepting the weight of it. "I spent so much time believing success meant giving us everything," he admitted. "I never realized you were disappearing inside it." Madeline glanced toward the rain-covered windows where Manhattan shimmered beyond the glass. "I do not think you meant to hurt me." Ryan looked at her carefully. "Does that make it easier?" She thought for several seconds before answering softly. "No, it just makes it sadder." Somewhere nearby, a worker switched off another row of gallery lights. Shadows deepened gently across the room, while warm reflections lingered faintly against the photographs still hanging on the walls. Ryan inhaled slowly. "Do you ever think we could have fixed it?" Madeline looked down briefly at the Leica camera resting against her side. "Maybe," she whispered. "If you had noticed I was lonely before I stopped asking you to." Ryan closed his eyes for a second after hearing that. Because deep down, he knew she was right. Love rarely dies all at once. It fades quietly through missed conversations, emotional absence, forgotten dreams, and years of believing someone will stay no matter how unseen they feel. Outside, a black car waited beside the curb beneath the rain. Eleanor had arranged transportation to take Madeline home before her flight to Paris the following afternoon. Paris, the city she once dreamed about photographing years before she became trapped inside a life built entirely around someone else's ambition. Madeline slipped her bag higher onto her shoulder and looked at Ryan one final time. "Goodbye, Ryan." He swallowed carefully. "Goodbye, Madeline." She turned then and walked slowly toward the gallery doors while rain shimmered silver against the Manhattan streets beyond the glass. Ryan watched her disappear into the night without asking her to stay this time. Because somewhere along the way, he finally understood something devastatingly simple. Love was never supposed to feel guaranteed. And the woman he once believed would always remain beside him had not left because she stopped loving him. She left because she spent too many years loving someone who stopped truly seeing her. Minutes later, Ryan stood alone inside the darkened gallery while the final spotlight above the lonely penthouse photograph slowly faded out. Outside, Manhattan still glittered exactly the same as it always had. But for the first time in his life, all the luxury in the world felt painfully empty without the woman who once filled it with warmth.